I'm Jessica Donner with Every Hour Counts, and I'm thrilled that you were able to join us. We have about 61 participants on the line and growing. So thank you for taking the time today to be with us to talk about how to create compelling messages on the value of expanded learning for young people. To begin, just to tell you a little bit about Every Hour Counts for those of you less familiar with us, we are a coalition of 9 leading expanded learning organizations around the country. We work to raise the profile of intermediaries and the value of building expanded learning systems. We believe that intermediaries and systems can play a critical role in ensuring that students who lack access to high-quality, life-changing enrichment experiences participate in those programs. It's been a challenge for us over the years to effectively communicate about the value of intermediaries. We get stuck in jargon-laden language, and our audiences would often get confused. I'm assuming I'm not alone in this sentiment. With the generous support of the Wallace Foundation, we engaged a terrific communications consultant, Andrea Sussman of Next Chapter Communications, to help us better message our work. We've been working with Andrea over the past few years to develop a suite of messaging resources, and then just over the past year, we turned those resources into the toolkit that we're sharing with you today so that you and other communities around the country can better utilize the language. A couple things about this toolkit. One, we're so excited we just put it out today. Many of you should have received it via email. Also in the chat box, we've given you a link for a download, but we're going to walk you through the toolkit, and you can feel free after the webinar to peruse it, but it is available online, and we hope that you'll find it useful. We developed it so that it could be really customizable for communities. It's yours for the taking. We want you to use the parts you find most helpful, share it with your staff and your board members and partners. Feel free to copy and paste language, particularly from particular sections that we'll speak about on the line. And we're also excited we included a usable worksheet to help you customize language for different audiences. One of the important things we learned in the messaging process is that repetition is a key part of persuasion. People need to hear the same thing from a variety of sources before they sink in. We are trying to win hearts and change minds. The more of us speaking in a common language in a variety of formats, whether it's print, electronic, or spoken language, the more likely we'll do that most effectively. I wanted to mention a few housekeeping items before I introduce our speakers. One, we have an hour and 15 minutes together on the line today. And while your lines are muted so that we avoid background noise, we do want to hear from you. One, we'll be asking some polling questions during the webinar, which I'll introduce in a minute, and we'd also like your input and questions throughout the webinar. If you look on the right-hand side of your screen, you can use the Q&A feature to send a question either to just the panelists or to everybody, and there's also a chat feature, and we'll be checking both throughout the webinar. If you have any technical difficulties, we have a colleague here who's terrific, Tasha Kellett, who's our web host. So if you get messages from a web host, that's Tasha. She can help you either call in or send you the PowerPoint deck if you're having trouble viewing it on the screen. Finally, we're recording this webinar, and it will be available on our website next week, and we'll also remind you at the end of the webinar for that website address. So in talking you through the agenda and the plan for today, we're first going to go into detail about what's in the communications toolkit and how you can make the most of it. We'll hear from Andrea Sussman, owner of Next Chapter Communications. We've been working with her, as I mentioned, for several years. She's also done individual support with our Every Hour Counts partners that they have found particularly useful, and she has worked with, in the past, a variety of clients related to our space, in particular, CASEL, Higher Achievement, and also she worked with the DC Public Schools. Also throughout our conversation, we'll hear from Michael Crowley, the Director of Communications for After School Matters in Chicago. After School Matters is the preeminent high school intermediary in the country and is a founding partner of Every Hour Counts. After School Matters' proven apprenticeship model and their unique focus on teens has made them a national and internationally recognized organization and leader in the out-of-school time movement. They're also terrific at communications, and Michael has helped develop this toolkit, so we're so happy that he came on the line today to share his experiences using these messages and also his advice for you through his experience at After School Matters. Again, we hope the information you hear today helps you get started with using these messages and communicating about your work and about expanded learning systems. We've planned for about 15 minutes of Q&A, but there's no need to save it all for the end. Send us questions at any time, and we'll answer them as we go along. And right now, we're going to start with a quick poll. So I've introduced a poll. So we'd like to know what communications challenges your organization currently faces. Check as many as you'd like here as we open the poll. We'll come back to the answers shortly. Also, if you answer other, so here the poll questions just popped up. And if you answer other, feel free to give us a little bit more detail after you submit the poll with your answer for what that means. And while these answers come in, I'm going to return to the question of why we invested in communications. One, our partner organizations were all struggling with questions about how to define their work and themselves. They had questions about many of the options included in the polling question we just asked you. So we decided to focus our communications effort and invest in some work that would help our national organizations, our partner organizations, and ultimately we hope to help the field. So now I'm going to turn things over to Andrea Sussman to introduce the toolkit.
Thank you, Jessica. While we are waiting for the polling results to come in, I'll just say thank you, and it's been a lot of fun to work with Every Hour Counts and its partner organizations. We're really starting to see how the focus on communications is playing out at each of these organizations, and you'll hear some examples of that soon from Michael. And everyone is really enthusiastic about sharing more broadly what we all learned together by going through that process. I am not seeing the polling results just yet, so I may just skip ahead unless Tasha, and here they are. Brilliant. So it seems that, excuse me, it seems that a lot of people have said that other seems to be the most popular thing. So that, I'm just going back to the polling question for just a second. So it seems that most people are facing a challenge of other. So I'd like to hear more about that if people want to send in some comments about that. What we heard from the Every Hour Counts partners is that they had the largest challenges in the first 3 items that are on this list. And that's what drove a lot of our decisions about messaging and also about the things that went into this toolkit. So we're going to dive into that right now. We started our work right after I started working with Every Hour Counts, which at that time was CBAS. The partner organizations happened to be meeting about an hour from Washington, D.C., which is where I live and work. So Jessica shoehorned me into an existing meeting so I could spend some time talking with the partners about why they wanted to do this communications work and what they hoped to get out of it. And here's what they said. They said, the words we use don't work. They said, we need a common language. And as we went around the table, people kept saying variations of these same ideas. The group wanted language that would be more accessible. They wanted clear, crisp language, language that's engaging, language that's memorable. It's what we call sticky. It sticks with people. And later in the process, we also tested some specific messaging ideas with key audiences. We weren't going to go out with any messages without testing them. I conducted telephone interviews with a variety of people whose work is connected to the field of expanded learning or who are opinion leaders in education. And these are the types of comments that we heard from them. We heard it should be about the what, not about the how. We heard people say, don't talk about your process. Talk about your goals and outcomes. Talk to people about people. And people who work in niches often believe the things that make sense to them implicitly have value to others. but you have to show why it matters and focus on the kids, not on the system, not on the entity that's building something. So this feedback that we got drove the development of the messaging that we put together, and it also drove the development of the toolkit that we're talking about today. So the toolkit walks through several aspects of messaging and communications. We'll touch on each of them today, and of course we'll hear from Michael Crowley about After School Matters and how he's putting them into action. But let's just start with a quick overview of what's in the toolkit. So all of the content in this toolkit grew out of either what the partners said they needed in order to communicate well, or what key audiences said they needed to hear in order to be motivated to act. So on this call today, we will talk about 3 messaging principles. We'll talk about speaking to your audiences. We'll spend a bit more time on messages as building blocks, which is most of the content of the toolkit. We'll spend some time on storytelling, 3 strategies for effective storytelling, because storytelling is at the heart of all messaging. And the toolkit also has, we'll go into the worksheet, which comes toward the end of the toolkit, the worksheet to help you organize your messages. And finally, the toolkit has additional detail on messaging research, some of which I just gave you a flavor of. And we've already discussed that. So let's start by talking about the 3 messaging principles. This is what the first page of that section in the toolkit looks like. So if you're following along, you can find it, 3 messaging principles. The first of which is focus on outcomes rather than process. You heard that in the feedback that we got from the people we interviewed. So what do we mean by that? Well, process messages define an organization by how it does its work. Sentences like, we build systems, or we bring people together, or we build bridges. Those are all process. Those are all about how you go about doing your work. So a conversation about whether we should say we build systems or whether we should say we build bridges isn't going to get you where you need to be. Outcomes messages focus on the content of the work, in this case, the kids, and the results of the work, providing educational opportunity to students, particularly underserved students, improving attendance rates, helping children connect with the activities that most interest them. Everyone who's on this call doesn't do their work in the exact same way, and the Every Hour Counts partner organizations don't do their work in the exact same way. But the content and the outcomes, the helping of children and youth, that unifies the work. And fortunately, that's exactly what your external audiences want to hear about. So that brings us to strategy number 2. It's about language. Use language that makes sense to external audiences. You heard Jessica talking earlier about how some people in the group were kind of caught in loops of using jargon, and that's not language that makes sense to external audiences. So your external audiences most likely are some combination of funders, policymakers, local government, parents. So it's essential to craft messages that speak to them, to the people you want to convince. Because if we don't speak in ways that make sense to our external audiences, we're really just talking to ourselves. External audiences, they don't want to hear about process or jargon or about the importance of systems. That's what they told us. They want to hear about results, the end game. So keep the focus on the children you're helping, why they need this help, the difference your work makes to close that gap between the help that's needed and getting students where they need to be. And that leads us to strategy number 3, which is always the key to all communications, which is telling audiences what's in it for them. So we just talked about how external audiences care about outcomes, not process, and they care about results. But in particular, they care about results that help them attain their own goals. So some of your audiences are probably already on board with your work. They might appreciate messages about the inner workings, for example, the intrinsic value of social and emotional learning or the intrinsic value of systems. But we can't move the ball by only talking to the people who already agree. We have to show audience how the work helps them reach their own goals. So that requires a little bit of work to think about and understand what goals your audiences have in mind. For example, policymakers have to get reelected. School leaders might be concerned with meeting state requirements or federal requirements. For them, we have to connect the work to the educational outcomes that they desire, and that might be development of 21st century skills. It might be better performance in school. It might be higher graduation rates. It might be lower dropout rates, higher attendance rates. It might be college readiness. So those are the things behind telling your audiences what's in it for them. Now, I've been talking for a little while, so I'm going to take a little break to have a chance to hear from you again. So let's do another quick poll. So this is a poll that goes in a slightly different direction. We're going to talk about messengers a little bit. So whose voices do you incorporate into your messaging? We have program partners, youth, government officials, teachers, principals, or once again, the ever-popular other. So I'm going to let this poll go. We have a couple more minutes before it closes. As I said before, we've been talking about content up till now, but now we're going to talk about messengers. This is who delivers the information. And who delivers the information often is as important as the information itself. It affects tone, it affects credibility, and it really affects emotional impact. So each person who's in this group offers a different kind of credibility. So for example, let's see, what do we have here? So we have program partners. Most people have program partners talking. About almost a third of you are using youth to talk, almost a quarter government officials, and slightly smaller percentages involving teachers and principals. So this is really helpful to know. It's helpful to think about because, for example, a mayor's commitment to your work might have a certain weight with funders. Youth voices are a really powerful way to show the results of your work and, of course, to boost the emotional impact of your message. Anyone who's ever heard a student participant speak knows what I mean by that. So that brings us to this next section of the toolkit, which is speaking to your audiences. It addresses, in part, messengers. And what this part of the toolkit covers is some things that will now start to sound familiar to you. Avoiding jargon. We've talked a little bit about that. Putting your audience's needs first. Focusing on outcomes rather than process. And using multiple voices. There are also some tips in this part of the toolkit about speaking to different audiences and what they need. You know, policymakers always want really short, quick bursts of information, and parents want detail about programs. Funders, you need to tie your communications to their specific funding priorities. And so this kind of detail you'll find in this section of the toolkit. Now we're going to move on to the heart of the toolkit, which is the messages themselves. This is what the first page of this part of the toolkit looks like. The section provides key messages about the value of expanded learning and of systems building, both as important investments and really as agents of community change. So we call it messages as building blocks because the messages are presented as individual elements, and the idea is that you can combine them in different ways to meet the needs of different audiences. So for example, this page shows two messages. You can see that the left column explains the type of message. So we have the need for expanded learning on the top part of the page, the solution on the bottom part, and the right column gives the language. So it gives the language that explains that kind of thing. So on this page, we're setting up what the problem is, and we're setting up how expanded learning provides the solution. The idea is that you can put the messages that are in the toolkit together in whatever order is going to best suit your needs. And the order is going to change most likely depending on who you're talking to. And it's always really important to emphasize your distinct value, your organization's own value that no one else offers. You do that with data, you do that with details about your work. You also do it with storytelling, which we're going to come to in a little bit after we get through a little bit more about these messaging. Other messages that are in the toolkit talk about why to invest in system building. They talk about expanded learning results. They talk about budget implications. And there's a section on expanded learning systems in action. That's the storytelling that we're going to get to in a minute. We also have a definition of expanded learning system. So this is language that's been vetted and tested quite a bit. The Every Hour Counts partner organizations were really struggling with how to define an expanded learning system. So we worked on a variety of different approaches to doing this, and this is where we landed, and as I said, it was tested with a number of different audiences. So you'll see from the beginning, the first sentence sets up the alternative, sets up what happens if you don't have a system. An expanded learning system replaces a patchwork of fragmented service providers with a cohesive team. So the idea here is that you're setting up what it looks like when you don't have a system, and then the value that the system adds. And the beginning of the second paragraph in this section tested really well with all of our audiences. It's the part that says the content of expanded learning varies from science to performing arts, nature studies, and sports. That was really what people needed to hear to understand what expanded learning really is, to make it concrete, to make it tangible, to make it something you could paint a picture with and you could imagine children standing in that picture and doing something. The rest of that paragraph starts to emphasize results. More connected to school, greater self-confidence, critical thinking skills, connecting with caring adults. So the idea here is that we set up a problem, we provide a solution, and we provide a clear picture of what's going on and the results that come from it. We also did the same thing with language describing the role of intermediaries. This is another place where the Every Hour Counts partners were struggling to define their work in ways that made sense to them, made sense to their audiences, and communicated the ideas that they wanted everyone to know. So we developed it, and again, we tested broadly this language, and it's action-oriented, and it focuses on the impact and the result of intermediaries. So we talk about increasing access by raising funds and targeting resources. We talk about driving improved student outcomes, improving efficiency, promoting continuous improvement, all very action-oriented, so we can show the real value that intermediaries provide. And now, as promised, we're going to talk a little bit about storytelling. Sorry, I misspoke. We're going to hear from Michael Crowley, Director of Communications of After School Matters in Chicago, and have him continue with talking about messaging.
Great. Thanks, Andrea. And this is Jessica. I'm interjecting for a second because we're sorry that the first poll didn't work for everybody. So what we're going to do is, before Michael speaks, we actually really want to hear your answers to this question. So we're going to open up the poll again right before Michael goes. So here you go. And I'm not going to pull up the slide, but if you could answer the question, what communications challenges does your organization face? A, explaining system building or our role in system building. 2, explaining why our work is important. C, convincing funders to invest in our work. D, communicating with providers that are directly serving families and students, or E, other. So if you could answer that, that'd be great, and we'll all look forward to seeing those poll results. So now I'm going to turn things over to Michael. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. It's a pleasure to join you. As Andrea mentioned, I am the Director of Communications with After School Matters here in Chicago. We work as a direct service provider, but also play the role of an intermediary to create after-school and summer program opportunities for Chicago public high school teenagers. We've been around since 1991, and we've reached more than 200,000 teens in that time. And that brings me to how the toolkit works for us. After School Matters, as I mentioned, is a large organization. We're providing 23,000 opportunities to high school teens this year through more than 1,000 programs in 69 of Chicago's 77 community areas. So that's obviously a great thing. However, the sheer size of the organization can make it difficult to focus our messaging, which creates the risk that we would then send a diluted or even confusing message about what we do and why it's important. So this toolkit is really helping me and my team and then all of our staff and stakeholders to focus our messaging by providing a backbone for everything we discuss. That gives us the ability to tie everything about After School Matters back to our core message, to repeat it, and to reinforce it. I want to add that a key element I've learned about making the case for expanded learning, but also making it compelling and unique, is to ensure that the case we're building reflects and communicates our organizational values. So yes, we are unique as an organization in that we focus on high school teens, and also, for example, that we pay teens a monetary stipend for their participation. But perhaps more importantly, we value teens for their inherent strengths, and we value the vast diversity of the teens and communities we serve. In other words, our teens, our youth, are our foundational building block for constructing that case for expanded learning. So I want to go into kind of a breakdown of how we put that case together. You can think of each of the case elements I'm going to go through here as building blocks that can be customized to your audience and also updated as your organization perhaps gets new data. So we're working harder and harder to put our impact front and center to reinforce that idea of messaging that is inarguable. So here's a slide showing that our teens' freshman on track rates as compared to peers who don't participate are much better, actually. And then here's an example of a slide showing the increased benefits of prolonged participation in our program, session after session. These are both taken from the annual report that we're working on currently. I'm going to go through these slides quickly, so please feel free to review in greater depth on your own. We follow up impact by transitioning to the need for our services, and there's a few different ways that we can do this. So here's a graphic showing the demand gap that we as an organization face. So while we have capacity to serve 15,000 unique teens each year, nearly 40,000 apply for those opportunities. And beyond that, there are many more teens who we could be reaching. And this reinforces the message that while we have great scale and great reach, we have much work to do. Another angle on need is what we call the investment gap that our teens face. You could also think of this as the opportunity or the achievement gap. But regardless, it shows how the teens we serve, almost entirely low income, are the teens who are least likely to have access to quality expanded learning. And what we do with this graphic is we show how our work is actually closing that gap for young people, here represented both in terms of dollars and hours invested in those young people. And I just want to add one further, but I think very important point on how you can show need is sometimes simply to pull from the headlines. And unfortunately, youth unemployment, youth violence, these are stories that are constantly in the headlines, certainly here in Chicago. And until we stop seeing headlines like that, we know that we have much more work to do. And then finally, we always want to come back to the opportunity that our programs provide, and specifically with a focus on how our audience, whoever that may be at a particular time, has a role to play. So this is just one specific example of a new facility that After School Matters has taken ownership of in Chicago's Belmont-Cragen neighborhood, and this is a booklet that we're working on to provide donors with opportunities to help us build it out. So again, this is one particular way, and I've shown a couple different elements of how we're building our case for expanded learning and specifically through After School Matters. But regardless of the sort of impact that we're showing, how we're characterizing the need for our services, and what particular opportunity we're presenting, the toolkit gives us a backbone to ensure that our case is clear, compelling, and empowering.
Great. Thank you, Michael. It's very helpful. Before we go back to the strategies for effective storytelling, which is next on our hit parade here, I want to go back to the poll that we sent out. As you can see, now that we have results that are working for everyone, more than half of people wanted language explaining system building, and 43% are facing a challenge of explaining why their work is important. And much lower percentages are concerned about communicating directly with the people they're working with, which makes sense. That absolutely mirrors what we heard from the Every Hour Counts partners, and that is why we put together this toolkit the way that we did. So thank you for responding to the polls. We appreciate it. So we're going to continue on with the other elements of the toolkit now and talk a little bit about storytelling. So we've alluded to this before. We talked about messengers. We talked about the value of youth impact. But we wanted to spend a little bit of time specifically on storytelling, because telling stories is the best way to make your work come to life, to make it vivid, to make it tangible, to show the results of what you're doing. But what is the best way to tell a story? And that's what this section of the toolkit addresses. So the first thing that's key to telling a good story is finding the right storyteller. So you have a lot of good stories about your work and a lot of potential storytellers, and what your audience is here is going to depend in part on, excuse me, on who's telling the story. So the most likely candidates for messengers are the people who are directly benefiting from your actions. That's students and their families. They are the best way to show the results, the best way to show the impact, and they're also going to get the most emotional response because, well, I think the answer to that is obvious. They're the ones who are directly benefiting. They're the ones who can tell you what it feels like to be in their roles. But other stories also are effective for certain audiences. A teacher can talk about how his or her students improved in their academic work, or your program's effect on his or her teaching, and what that means from an academic standpoint or from a professional standpoint. A community member can encourage others to volunteer by sharing their experiences working with students or saying what they saw in the 6 months that they worked with a particular group of students, for example. And of course, public officials can talk about the impact on the community and the policy impact of the work, and public officials bring a different kind of credibility to the work, especially with funders. So if your situation allows it, depending if you're having an event, let's say, and you're thinking who's going to come to the front of the stage, try to pair storytellers. Try to have a student with a teacher or a parent with the mayor so that you get different perspectives so audiences can hear different points of view and put them together, and they get a more complete picture that way. So the next part of telling a good story is having a beginning, a middle, and an end. So sometimes people think that they're telling a good story when they're listing a bunch of needs or a bunch of accomplishments. But that's not what makes it a story. What makes it a story is that it's a narrative that engages people. You set a stage at the beginning, you have a middle that draws people in, and an end that provides a satisfying result or resolution or some questions to ponder. You know, not every story is wholly positive. Sometimes if you're trying to move a community to act, you want to end with some open questions because that's going to move you to the next point where you want them to be. And so the important part is to think, what do I want out of getting this story? What do I want people to think? What do I want them to do? And then you craft your story accordingly. The toolkit actually provides one good formula for doing this, which is problem, solution, result. So you lay out the problem, you say how your organization provided the solution, and then you give the result. And that's often a great way to help a student who's telling a story about his or her experience structure it. So we recommend that. And then the last part, the last of our 3 strategies, is asking people to take action. So always remember why you're telling your story. You're telling it to engage people, to encourage them to act. That's why you're doing all of your messaging. And storytelling is a really good entry point for asking for action. So you have a student who's telling a story about her experience with your program, and then you can explicitly ask people to take the action of helping students like these have opportunities. Give us money to help more students have opportunities like these. Volunteer so we have more mentors and we can have more relationships, like you just told a story about a mentor-student pair. Or now's the time to get out there and support this particular policy so that we can do more work like this. So always connect the story that you're telling to the action that you want people to take. And I mentioned just now, a story about a mentor. Mentor-student pairs are another really good way to go when you're trying to pair different messengers, because they can tell 2 opposite sides of the same story, and it can be really powerful. The toolkit also, by the way, includes advice for communicating through social media, which is another part of your communications that you want to make sure you attend to, because it's a great way to reach a lot of your audiences. And now we're going to go back to Michael to hear how he is taking the storytelling advice and using it in the field.
Thanks, Andrea. So I'm going to provide sort of a specific case study of how we've told our story through what I think is a particularly effective format, and that's video. So I'm basically going to take you through our approach to this particular video and show some screenshots from it. This video that I'm talking about, it does serve as an institutional piece for After School Matters. It provides background and an overview of the organization, but its specific focus is on fundraising. It's a donor-specific piece. So Andrea mentioned the importance of finding the right storyteller. For this video, it was our board chair who narrates the video and appears at the end to address the audience directly and make an ask. It was critical, however, that we made it clear that the stars of the video are our teens and our alumni, the people we serve. So immediately and all throughout the piece, you never have a doubt that we are an organization dedicated to the empowerment of high school teenagers. So in terms of telling the story, we chose to highlight 5 individual personal stories with an emotional connection. So here's one of our alumni, Arshad, letting us know that he got a full scholarship to St. Mary's University. And here's Camille, one of our teens who's in our advanced culinary program. And it never hurts to show a delicious dish in a video either. We also showed our impact, represented here through our high school graduation and post-secondary rates. And then here, visualizing the need that I spoke of earlier across the city, represented here by the demand gap that we face. And then we closed out this video with direct testimonials from several of our board members and other civic supporters who issued a specific call to action. Altogether with this piece, I think we told a compelling story, but we also created this sort of sense of momentum that really cannot be stopped and that specifically engages the audience to step up and to play a role. I want to add briefly that I think approaching storytelling in this way is effective across a variety of formats, not just video. So this is a screenshot of the annual report that we're working on right now. And I'll say that the way we're approaching the annual report, which is a printed and also an electronic piece, we're approaching it in much the same way that we approached the video that I just spoke of, and that's with the intention of telling a compelling story.
Great. Thank you, Michael. I would also add that in the examples that Michael showed you, they have great visuals. And the images, the photographs that After School Matters uses are really fantastic. And, as you're looking at budgeting, it is always, photography often can be, it's a decision about how much resources to put into any part of your communications. But do not underestimate the value of powerful images. So now we're going to move into talking about how to actually get some of this work done. So there is a section of the toolkit, Worksheet for Organizing Messages. This is what the first page of it looks like. And the idea here, I'm going to just move on. We're going to zoom into just the lower part of this page. So this is the chart that was at the bottom of the page that you just saw. And the idea is to use this worksheet to develop and organize your messages. And so I'm going to show you there are blank ones with different audiences. And the idea is that you start with the columns on your left, and then you move across in order. So you start with what's your desired action? What do you want this audience to do? How can this audience help you support your agenda? And then the second question is, well, what does the audience want? Remember, we talked about you need to speak in terms of your audience's own needs. So what does this audience want? What does this audience want to have happen? And then you want to figure out what's the connection between number 1 and number 2. So which are the messages from the messages as building blocks? Is it, for example, the need? Is it the result? Is it the storytelling? What's going to help you connect what you want your audience to do with what they need to be motivated to act? The fourth column is the priority message. So you might have come up with a bunch of different messages to answer number 3, but for number 4, so what's the most important? Because you can only start with one sentence. And so where do you want to start? And it's important to think that through because, again, you want to be thinking about a beginning, a middle, and an end. How are you going to set things up? How are you going to close it out? And what are you going to use to link them together? What's the heart of the story? And then the secondary messages are obviously what wasn't the priority message. And so you put them in the order that's going to make sense. And then perhaps most important is the local details. What's the local data, the local story? What is it that is unique about your program that's going to appeal to this audience? So stories about students and their families, data about what's happening locally in your community, or national data. If you don't have local data, use national data, and then tie that into what you're trying to do locally. Say, this is where we want to go. Use examples from other cities' programs, if that's helpful. Say, this is what they did. We want to do something like that. everything you can do to make it more tangible, more concrete, and tied to your local community. And the other thing I'll say about this is that it's really tempting to just jump to number 4, to say, okay, we want to reach funders. What's the right message for them? But it's really helpful to actually go through the steps in order, because it's going to help you hone in on what you want to say, tailor it properly, and make sure that you're connecting all the dots for your funders. We tend to, when we're working with the same language over and over again, or when we're trying to reach a bunch of different audiences, we have a shorthand that we start to use amongst ourselves, but you really need to make sure you're connecting the dots for each of your audiences. And the path to connect for the dots may be different for different audiences, and that is the purpose of these worksheets. And you'll see as you go through the toolkit, there are messages for different audiences. So here's a blank one for funders, for example. And then there are different blanks for policymakers, for funders, for educators, for parents, for all your different audiences, and you can make your own. You can fill out the ones that are in the toolkit, you can make your own, and just really use it as an opportunity to think about who you're trying to reach and what you want them to do. And now, since I skipped ahead accidentally a moment ago, we're going to talk to Michael and have him describe how he and his organization actually used this worksheet in order to think through some of their projects. And before I turn it over to you, Michael, I'm just going to remind people, please, to submit questions when you can. If you have any questions, just use the Q&A feature that's to the right side of your screen, so that we can get to them. Thank you.
Thanks, Andrea. So, yes, here is an example of how we use this worksheet for that video that I just described. As I mentioned, the target audience was funders. Our desired action was for the audience to provide financial support to After School Matters. Our audience's goal, we believe, is to make a smart investment that will have a positive long-term impact on young people here in Chicago. Now, the relevant messages that we wanted to get across include the need, so the demand and the investment gaps for underserved teens, those who want and deserve more opportunities, is at risk of widening. That gets to the need. The solutions, so After School Matters works to close those gaps. The results, basically that our teens are succeeding at higher rates than their peers thanks to participation. And then the opportunity, which in a nutshell is that we cannot keep this momentum going without your support, without the support of our audience. The priority message, as I've mentioned before, and as the toolkit states in a lot of different situations, is results. And that was particularly the case for this piece. Those results include our impact, but also showcasing what teens are actually doing in programs. So that's where those engaging, vibrant visuals come into play. Secondary messages are listed here in order of what I think are the importance for that particular video that we created: opportunity, need, and solution. And then finally, on local details, just a couple examples, some of which I've already mentioned, could include things like Chicago's youth unemployment rate. And of course, always nothing helps to tell the story or really heighten the relevance better than great teen alumni program profiles, really bringing to life the story through the youth that we serve.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Michael and Andrea. But it's very helpful to hear how an organization communicates, particularly for After School Matters, how you tap into your participant voices and lessons learned over the years and how you communicate. And thank you, Andrea, for walking us through the toolkit and describing some of the background context on our work. So some questions are coming in. And I'm going to start with the first question that we have up. So, and for others, please start to post some questions for us. So, what strategies or recommendations do you have when you have a mixed audience or various stakeholders in a meeting or public forum? Michael, do you want to take the lead on that first?
Sure. I think that's a great question because that's probably a lot of the situations that we find ourselves in. You don't necessarily get to choose your audience. I would say that, you need to elevate the key elements of your case that you're going to be making, but if you're in a mixed audience like that, I would just emphasize the importance of really being as clear, crisp, and concise as you can be, so that you don't go too far down the path of going into one element that maybe one particular audience does not have as much of an interest in. So really keeping things as impactful and as tight as you possibly can when you have a larger, varied audience like that.
Great. Thank you. Andrea, do you have anything you want to add there?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think Michael is exactly right. And the other part of the answer, I think, is what's the purpose of the meeting or the public forum? Because the first, you always want to be thinking about, what do I want to get out of this? So we have helped organizations when they're having meetings because there's a huge disagreement, among the people who are participating. We've helped organizations who are having a public meeting because they're sharing positive news. So it really depends on what you're trying to get out of the meeting, what's the problem you're trying to solve or the issue you're trying to address, and that's going to help you focus in your message as well. And, leaving time for people to ask questions so you can make sure you're hitting on what they need also is a useful strategy. Great,
thank you. Michael, I wanted to follow up on your communications for funders. And wanted to get your advice on the difference between how you message to public versus private funders.
Sure. So I guess I would say, broadly speaking, private funders, I think we tend to focus more on outcomes and impact. Public funders, maybe perhaps, certainly there's no less importance on outcomes, but maybe elevating the importance of cost savings and how, what we do is a very smart investment because it costs less dollars to invest this into a teen, for instance. But I guess what I would say a little bit more broadly is that within each of those audiences, private funders and public funders, there are a lot of different sub-audiences, and I think it's still important to find out what that particular sub-audience is interested in. So, for instance, you could have either a private or a public funder, so either a foundation, say, or a particular city agency whose focus is on youth violence, or whose focus is on a particular community, say on the south side of Chicago here, Englewood or something. And then for each of those audiences, whether they're private or public, really elevate the work that you're doing and how it's having an impact on what that interest is, and do that with both impacts, so statistics about what your programs are doing, but also stories and anecdotes. That really helps to make it relevant, makes it personal, makes that emotional connection. So pairing the outcomes and the impact with the actual real-life stories of the youth you're serving, regardless of the audience, I think that really helps to get the message across.
Great, thank you. We got a few more questions in on social media, so I'm going to ask both of them to our panelists, and also one to my colleague here, Tasha, but we'll start with, I think, Andrea, if you want to take this first. How do you internally make the case for doing more with social media to organizational leadership who are not as familiar with social media and why it is so important?
Well, I think the question is to figure out what's the stumbling block. What's making them, is it that they don't think that it's a worthwhile use of staff time, or they don't think that it can have an impact, or some other reason? Because the answer to convincing anyone of anything is to figure out what's the stumbling block, what's keeping them from wanting to do it. If it's a question of staff time, then that can be a tricky thing, but you can start to think about how can we do this in a way that isn't a time suck. I think that's always the concern about social media, is that it's a black hole that people dive into and you never see them again. But it's also really looking at what the outcomes can be, and sometimes looking at other organizations and how they're using social media and what it's getting for them is going to help with that. And also thinking about what your goals for social media really are. Are you going to use it as a fundraising tool? Are you going to use it to try to get people to come to an event? Are you going to use it as a way to connect with people emotionally, because social media is such a powerful way to do that? It's a great way to tell stories. If you have good video or good images, it's a great way to get them out there. And you also might talk with some of your networks, who could be a part of your social media network, and start seeing how they are using it. So, for example, if you want to reach out to parents through social media, if you could start to see how parents are using social media, then you can show the skeptical internal audience, how involved this particular target audience is with social media so they see that that's really a way to reach them.
Great, thanks. And now I'm going to have my colleague, Tasha Kellett, also respond to the question because she's had some experience with this.
Yeah, I think Andrea shared so many things that were really helpful to consider when you're speaking with, people in your organization who are hesitant to get on social media. I think one of the stumbling blocks that many organizations face as well is just concern that, there have been stories about social media not going well for organizations or not using it in a way that matches their organizational values or their culture. So if you're thinking about trying to invest people in your organization in having a social media strategy, it's thinking about what those stumbling blocks are, like Andrea mentioned. But then also I think doing some of that education piece of explaining the different channels of social media and which you think will be most appropriate for your organization, whether that's LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, and who the audience, or Instagram, and who the audience of that channel will be and how you see that playing into your organization's mission and what you could get out of it. And then also I think bringing up, as you're pitching the idea of using social media, the idea that you'll need guidelines as an organization. Here's what we use it for, here's what we don't, and here's how we can educate other staff members on that so that it's supporting your work.
Great. Thanks. It's a great question. Okay, all these are great questions. So I'm going to turn this to Michael, also on social media. Do you have any suggestions for increasing social media connections with the community?
Sure. So the first thing I'll say is talk to your young people. Talk to the folks that you're serving. We have a small but mighty communications team here at After School Matters, but they really do an outstanding job of actually going out and talking to the youth we're serving because, they are certainly all over social media, and they can often provide some of the insights that I myself might not know about. And that can really help you to get an understanding of how you can exponentially increase your reach. So it's not just your organization, putting the word out there, but other people grabbing it and then talking to their stakeholders and then so on and so on. That really helps to increase your reach in a way that, we could never just do on our own. And I completely agree with what Tasha said about putting a plan together, putting a strategy together. Don't just toss up an Instagram page. Really think about it, do a little bit of research into it, talk to your youth, because I guarantee you they are on Instagram, and then decide what your goals are with it. If it's to, to help with fundraising, if it's to spread the word about a particular policy or a program that's new and exciting that you want folks in a particular community to know about, really get specific with your strategy. And, I understand the issue of staff time, and if you don't have someone dedicated to do that, but I think it can be incorporated into what you might already be doing with communications, and think about this as just another arm of that strategy, but a very important one.
Great. Thank you. Okay, so last call for questions, and we may end early. Before we close with one last question, unless something else comes in, I just want to remind everyone to please stay in touch. Here on our slide, we have our Twitter and our Facebook handle. If you go to our website, www.afterschoolsystems.org, there's ways there where you can sign up for our blog, our listserv, and we will follow up with you all next week and send you the recording of this webinar. Also, please stay in touch with me if there's certain aspects of this toolkit that you find particularly useful or ways in which you're using it. It's really helpful for us to learn about that. We love to hear your stories and how you're using this information. And it's fulfilling for us too. And if you have questions or you think that there's some missing pieces in here or things that you wish were here and that we didn't include, let us know as well. And we'll think about other things that we can produce that can be helpful for the field. So my last question, in light of nothing else coming in, is for just Michael and Andrea to give us just your final sort of last piece of advice for everyone on the line as they think about how they're improving their communication strategies.
Okay, do you want me to go first?
Sure, yeah.
Go ahead, Andrea.
So I would say be intentional about what you're doing. So don't just think, oh, we need a brochure, or oh, we need as Michael said, an Instagram feed. Think about who your audiences are, what you want them to do, what they need to hear, what you want them to know, what you want them to do, and what's going to motivate them, and then act accordingly. Resources are scarce, and so you want to make sure you're using all of your communications, dollars and hours in a way that's going to be effective, and that just requires some planning. And good luck.
I'll add, I can't emphasize enough how important I think it is to lead with your youth, to put your young people front and center. They're the core of everything that we do. But also I'll add, I think it's particularly helpful to think about your communication not just as a one-to-one type thing, but think about it as actually working to empower the people you're talking with to then take your message to another level. So if you're talking to an elected official, think about that elected official then going to a community meeting and spreading the word to all of his constituents, his or her constituents. Think about it in an exponential way, and I really think that that's where you can take your communications to another level.
And if I could add just one more, I know you said one, Jessica, but I'm throwing out two because I think it builds on what Michael just said. Don't be afraid to be bold. Some of the best communications has edge, and don't be afraid to do something that's a little unusual and is maybe more strongly worded, has a little edge to get people's attention.
I completely agree with that.
Great. Ditto. Thank you. Thank you again to Andrea and Michael for putting together this presentation with us today. Special thank you to Andrea for working with us over the years to develop the messaging language and also work with us so closely to develop this toolkit. And a special shout out to the Lawless Foundation for generously supporting this work, and to all of you for being on the line today. So we look forward to staying in touch. And thanks again. Have a wonderful afternoon.